China's surveillance balloons over the skies of the United States have triggered a full-blown global spat. Media reports suggest that India has not been exempt from this surveillance exercise either. I'm Barkha, Dutt, you're watching the Mojo Story. In a few moments from now, we'll be talking to a very, very interesting newsmaker today, the author of a new book on China that looks at how Beijing is using soft power and information wars to try and assert control and its expansionist impulse all across the world. All of this, of course, comes in the backdrop of continuing tensions between India and China. Our countries continue to be in a state of what could be called no war, no peace. There is no immediate resolution to the border conflict. And of course, now we've seen a full-blown spat between the United States and China at the Munich Security Conference, where the US has given a warning to China over surveillance balloons, and China in turn has called the United States response hysterical and over the top. Should the world be paying much more attention to what China is actually doing with its soft power, with its attempt to control media narratives? That is the subject of a new book by Joshua Kurlantzick, who's of course a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Joshua joins us now from the United States of America. It's good to see you, Josh, and thank you for making the time. All of this that you argue in your new book, and we'll get to it in a moment, comes in the backdrop of these balloon wars. They were received with some mirth in India, but they've turned out to be something pretty serious, and multiple media reports from the Post to the Financial Times suggest that India may not have been exempt from these surveillance attempts either. Before I come to the media wars, because how the media tells the story of these balloon wars is also key to what you argue in your book. What do you make of these this very public battle, most recently at the Munich Security Conference between the US and China over these surveillance balloons?
Well, I think the very public sort of dressing down and actions by it sort of put the lie. There was this idea that in backing down on his zero COVID policy and backing off a little bit on the more assertive diplomacy, that Xi Jinping take a sort of approach of trying to have some degree of rapprochement with the US, maybe with India, with some of the other countries with which China has pretty poor relations. He appointed as foreign minister a diplomat who had been ambassador to Washington, who was somewhat more moderate. But then I think the balloons, which were destined to be seen, so you have to wonder why they even did it, because they were going to be seen. And then some of these other actions, like the very public actions in Munich, I think put the lie to that and suggest that Xi Jinping is just not the type who's going to change the way he is, not the type to change at all. And these sort of rapprochement, or the idea that there was going to be a back off in the assertiveness is not accurate. And and when it comes to India, I think you see that in terms of there was, some people had been saying, well, maybe there's going to be a back off in terms of the aggressive incident, cross-border incidents, but there really hasn't been. And so I suspect that they're going to continue at the same rate or higher.
Now let's come to your book. It's a very interesting argument that you actually suggest that perhaps China is looking in part to create its own version of, let's say, an Al-Jazeera, and that China might look to justify this sort of state-controlled media seeking global credibility by arguing that the United States of America had a Voice of America, Qatar has Al Jazeera, the BBC is also tax-funded. And of course, you've made the argument that these analogies don't hold because all of these other outlets can be completely critical of their own governments. But why would China at this point need an Al Jazeera type sort of media behemoth, as it were? China itself is a behemoth. China's sort of economic imperialism, it furthers its expansionist ambitions. Why does it need to unleash this media offensive?
Well, I'm not sure Al Jazeera can criticize its own government, but it definitely produces excellent reporting all over the rest of the world.
Yes. Al Jazeera can criticize everybody but Qatar. But yes, go ahead. Yes.
But I think the issue is that China feels that despite the fact that it's economically powerful, that it lacks the ability to shape global narratives, what it calls discourse power, about everything about itself, about its economy, about what its actions abroad, et cetera. And it actually feels quite weak, and that global narratives about everything are shaped by media based in the big democracies. So the New York Times, the BBC, India has quite a few big media outlets that are well known on the global stage. The Nikkei, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Le Monde. We could go through a whole list but that basically narratives about China and about what China's doing in the world are shaped by those organizations. And China doesn't really have a credible media organization that can shape narratives. Now, the reason it doesn't have a credible media organization is because it's a one-party authoritarian state, and most people historically wouldn't believe that. Al-Jazeera is a little unique because no one really cares that much about whether it reports on Qatar, but Qatar allows it to report freely and independently on most other things around the world, so people believe that. Those other things like the BBC, the Voice of America, et cetera, have in place guidelines that allow for editorial independence. So China feels they may seem strong, but they have this very, very strong feeling of their own weakness. And they feel like every time there's an incident of anything that relates to China, the world's democracies define, the media from the world's democracies define how that is seen. So they very much want to create outlets that can be competitive. My argument in the book is that they have succeeded with only one. They have poured a lot of money into an like China Global Television Network and a radio station called China Radio International. But those and for a while they hired a huge number of foreign journalists at those places, including some very good journalists. But those outlets really put out pretty much just sort of very bland propaganda-ish material that any viewer can see through. Xinhua, their newswire, has been more successful, and that's because a lot of times Xinhua signs these agreements with news outlets, not so much in India, but very, very common in other parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia, Africa, other regions. And the news outlets use Xinhua, incorporate it into their own coverage, and then often don't either note that it's from Xinhua, or they might create at the bottom. And so people are picking up this reporting as if it's real, accurate reporting and crediting it like it's quality reporting. So Xinhua has been somewhat successful for China, but the others, I argue, have not been.
And when you sort of call this Beijing's attempt at a global media offensive, what shape and form would this typically take? One is funding, as you mentioned, training trips for journalists across the world to come to China, something that is not atypical for Western nations to do as well. And many people may take the opportunity because to get inside of China is so difficult till, of course, you discover that this is all fully chaperoned. And you quote even Anand Krishnan, who's, of course, one of India's best known journalists on China in this context. But this global media offensive, what shape and form is it taking that the world hasn't stood up to notice fully yet?
Well, that's certainly part of it. I mean, I think that was kind of almost completely unknown, except to a few places like India and a few other countries where journalists were, this was before COVID, but they're starting it up again. Journalists were going on these programs and really being fed a really false diet of what China is like. That is really not well known in much of the world. So you have to wonder, they were training hundreds of journalists a year. You're sending hundreds of journalists back to Africa, South Asia, Europe, lots of Latin America. What that is, that's definitely very, very little known. I think also Xinhua really becoming a global news agency where it's used a lot is very little known because, we in the media think of ourselves, and I was a journalist before I came to this job, that people pay close attention to, and they pay close attention to who hosts a TV show. So you're the character, but in print journalism, very rarely do people really read and see who the byline is and pay attention. And so I think the idea that people are reading this Xinhua copy and that's coming through and producing basically propaganda is not well known. And then I think that is really, really poorly understood is that most of the Chinese language press around the world, which is quite a substantial number of people in Southeast Asia, in the US, Australia, the UK, other places, there are millions of people who read Chinese or watch Chinese as their first language, is almost completely now pro-Beijing. Either state companies have taken over the media, or people from those countries who are very sympathetic to or have business interests in Beijing, very common with Beijing, very common in Southeast Asia, have taken over these outlets and completely destroyed independent Chinese language coverage of China. So you're robbing the Chinese diaspora of independent coverage. Known, we don't fully have a good appreciation of, is the extent that China's huge global social media platforms, what impact they will have on the world. Now, some countries like India have just straight up banned TikTok. But, in other places, that's actually quite unusual. In most other countries, TikTok has become so popular. I have two children. I have an older child. He's a teenager, and TikTok is to his friends like the source of so many different things. It's like a super platform for them, and they are getting their news through it too. And there's a reckoning coming in the US about how to deal with TikTok, and in probably every other democracy as well, in Australia. But TikTok is basically, it's owned by a company based in China, and that company has a board seat that's held by the Chinese government. As of now, users who use TikTok have their data that flows through Chinese servers. And for most democracies, eventually, I think that's going to be acceptable. But at the same time, politicians like Joe Biden, he doesn't want to be the guy who bans TikTok, and like disappoints millions and millions and millions of young voters, and is the old man who takes away their TikTok. So they got to come up with some resolution. Those are quite, TikTok and WeChat are quite popular, quite powerful apps, and they're really globally competitive at this point.
And I think what's interesting is that, just like you say, that people don't read bylines, and I actually think they don't even frankly notice who anchors a show. When you're using apps, when you're using a TikTok, or when you're using a China-made phone, you don't actually stop to pay attention. Like there was so much anger in India at one point against China after what happened at the border, and India lost 20 soldiers, that there was this call to economically boycott Chinese goods. But of course, Chinese companies are so embedded now in markets all over the world that it's easier said than done. Now, I have two questions for you. You spoke about the intersection of business and media when it comes to China. And there's a very interesting account in your book of a hotel chain that actually pulls a newspaper from its lobby that has critical reporting on China. And that is how business and the information wars intersect. So why don't you share that story?
Sure. I mean, that it was just one of, we could come up with many, many large global corporations that happen to be Sofitel, which is a French, I'm not actually sure what the parent company is, if it's still Accor, but it's part of a French, giant hotel conglomerate. And they in Australia pulled this newspaper from their lobby because it had coverage that was unflattering the Chinese government, and that was more important to them. And that was just one example, but we could pull out many, including there are certainly American companies just as or more guilty. I mean, basically, since 7 years in Tibet, which was almost 25 years ago, there really hasn't been, and a movie made by Martin Scorsese around the same time about the current Dalai Lama, there really hasn't been a Hollywood movie that in any way portrayed anything about China in a negative light. And in fact, some Hollywood films have gone out of their way to do ridiculous things, like portray, like in one of the Mission Impossible movies, China complained that Tom Cruise was shooting, and they were going to shoot scenes in Shanghai, and they wanted to shoot some of them in some of the older parts of Shanghai, which are quite beautiful. And the Chinese government was angry because some of those don't look that modern. And so they just they changed the location and did whatever they wanted. So, I think that's a huge issue. Most companies, until very recently, basically went along and did whatever China wanted. That's starting to change, I think, because there's been so much pressure from governments from the US, from some European governments, from India, from this current Indian government, and from other countries like Japan, South Korea. And also what's happened is China has tried to use economic coercion in a couple of places, and it hasn't worked so well. Like with Australia, China was very angry with Australia over several things, including Australia demanding an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID and some other things. And they really put the hammer down on Australia, on wine, on a lot of other agricultural products. And the Australian government didn't really change, and they weren't unhurt, but they weren't as hurt as badly, I think, as China thought. And so I think there is a kind of decoupling happening in which a lot of companies are beginning to question whether they should be in China long term. Now, there are companies like Apple where they have no choice. They're in China for the long term.
I was just going to say that this, we keep seeing reports about how Apple may move a plant to India or not, but that doesn't really address the core issue. The Chinese market is just too gigantic for any of these companies, perhaps, to take the kind of ideological positions that some might expect. My question to you in the end is what this might mean. A lot of our viewers in India, there's great amount of concern about China. There are also those who've begun to argue that China is the greater adversary than, let's say, a Pakistan. There are others who say, no, it's not the same because we've never really, fired bullets at the border except for what happened in Galwan. My question is this: from the point of view of India emerging as a countervailing force to China, especially in this part of the world, do you think Indian measures like banning TikTok are measures that the rest of the world may emulate? Or do you think that these are little drops that don't take into account the scale and the depth of the Chinese information war?
Well, I do think some countries I don't think other countries are going to ban TikTok, but I think it's possible they will if they can't come to some arrangement in which they are allowed, TikTok lets them store their users' data in their own country. So if, for example, if the Biden administration doesn't come to some resolution with TikTok in which American users' data is stored in the US, then I think he will, although he doesn't want to, ban TikTok. So perhaps India is sort of an originator in this way. I think that a lot of other countries are going to make those same demands with a ban as a possibility, but first they will simply demand, and it may be that TikTok will work out, agreements with most countries that make those demands to keep their users' data. I don't think that necessarily that for some of these companies, it's the market plus the supply chain that they've built that allows China. For example, for Apple, it's not only the market. Actually, Apple has lost a lot of market share in selling phones in China. It's that they've built such a massive supply chain in China that it's almost impossible for them. Were they to try to completely replicate that supply chain in India, it would cost them a staggering sum that they basically can't get out of China. It's not possible for them now. Now, other companies may, and some of them already are. They're moving to India, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, etc., other places. I think that in terms of the information warfare, China also, another aspect that's not well understood is that China is still pretty young and nascent in some of the other tactics that actually other countries like Russia. I know Russia and China and India actually have a pretty good relationship, but Russia is actually much more skilled at information warfare than China. And China has begun to learn from Russia's tactics And as China becomes more skillful with some of the things Russia has done well, then you can become even more worried. And I think that is something that's beginning to happen, and you're seeing some of that. In terms of whether China is the greater adversary than Pakistan, whatever, I don't know enough about India's strategic culture to I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. Joshua, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Fascinating new book. I think one of the things, TikTok is a great example of how you actually don't pay attention. When I say you, I mean consumers, users don't pay attention to where a product has been made or is being controlled from. And that's the reason why these information offensives can be as successful and entrenched as they have turned out to be in so many parts of the world. So I think it was important that your book flagged that, and perhaps the world will pay greater attention to it. Thank you very much, Joshua Kurlantzick, for talking to us. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.